Simon was a small Sprunki, living in a remote village filled with light and joy. From a young age, he was the centerpiece of cheerful tales and carefree games with Brud, his closest friend, as dear as a brother. Simon was kind-hearted, even timid. He loved tending to flowers and caring for small animals in the nearby forest. Everyone in the village admired his gentleness, and some even predicted that he would grow into a wise and compassionate elder. One day, while the two were playing by a stream, Brud slipped and fell. Simon quickly pulled his friend up, but in the chaos of the moment, Simon accidentally bit a small chunk of Brud's arm. The sensation of soft skin and the warmth of blood stunned Simon. He immediately let go, overwhelmed with guilt as he met Brud's pained but trusting eyes. "Simon, are you okay?" Brud asked, holding his bleeding arm but showing no anger. "I know you didn't mean it." Simon nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. That night, he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but beneath it, a strange, forbidden pleasure began to stir, a feeling both unfamiliar and gratifying. That night, as he lay in bed, the memory of that moment kept resurfacing, bringing with it an irresistible urge. At first, Simon tried to shake off these bizarre thoughts. He buried himself in his daily routines, spending more time caring for flowers and avoiding Brud as much as possible. But the urges returned, stronger each day, like a shadow creeping closer every time he turned away. He experimented by biting bark, stones, and even juicy apples, but nothing could replicate that initial sensation. The thought of reliving it both thrilled and horrified him. Not long after, he began buying raw meat from the village market to sink his teeth into. Each time his sharp teeth pierced the tender flesh, a part of him felt satisfied, but another part sank deeper into shame. He hid this habit, sneaking into the woods to avoid the prying eyes of the villagers. Simon told himself this would be the last time, but the craving only grew stronger. Eventually, he started wandering into the forest, hunting small creatures. At first, it was harmless insects, but they soon failed to satiate him. He moved on to small animals, rabbits and birds that once were his childhood companions. Each time, he justified his actions. "They're just tiny creatures. I'll stop when I've had enough." But he never felt satisfied. Despite his growing shame, Simon couldn't stop. He began avoiding the village altogether, fearful that someone might notice his pale complexion and trembling hands. The once bright and cheerful Simon was becoming a ghost of his former self, haunted by his uncontrollable urges. One night, Brud, exhausted after a long day of exploring the forest, fell into a deep sleep. Simon sat beside him, gazing at his closest friend. The memory of that first bite flooded his mind, stirring a confusing mix of guilt and pleasure. Simon clenched his fists, trying to resist the urge clawing at his mind. "No," he whispered to himself, "I won't hurt him again." But the darkness within him was relentless. It whispered promises of relief, of fulfillment, if only he gave in. Overcome by an uncontrollable instinct, Simon leaned down and bit into Brud's shoulder. Brud screamed in pain, the sound tearing through the quiet night. Simon froze as he met Brud's horrified, betrayed eyes. The sight of his friend's bleeding wound snapped Simon back to reality. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding with fear and self-loathing. I'm sorry," Simon stammered, but Brud's expression was enough to break him. Instead of facing the consequences, Simon ran. He fled the village, away from the accusing eyes of the other Sprunki and the growing darkness within him. From that day, Simon never returned to the village. He wandered through the night, searching for new victims to feed his insatiable hunger. At first, it was strangers lost in the woods, travelers unaware of his presence. Soon, he began targeting villagers from nearby settlements. The darkness within him grew, slowly consuming both his body and soul. His skin turned ashen, his eyes glowed red, and his teeth sharpened. like those of a predator. The innocent laughter that once defined him was replaced by guttural growls. Simon avoided his reflection, unable to face what he was becoming. In his solitude, Simon tried to reason with himself. "I'm not a monster," he whispered into the void. But the memories of his deeds said otherwise. The most terrifying thing wasn't Simon's transformation. It was the darkness he was nurturing. It wasn't merely a metaphor. It was a sentient force, feeding on his hunger, growing stronger with each bite. It waited, patient but eager, to break free from its vessel, Simon's body, and unleash itself upon the world. Simon began to realize this through recurring nightmares. In his dreams, he saw himself dissolve, giving way to a monstrous entity of immense power and terror. The shadow in his dreams would whisper his name, mocking him, promising destruction. Simon tried to resist, to suppress his cravings, but his body grew weaker with every attempt to abstain. He was trapped in a cycle of hunger and despair, unable to escape the pull of the darkness within. One night, under the crimson glow of a full moon, Simon stood atop a hill, feeling the darkness within him surge, ready to shatter its containment, his own body, to escape into the world. He let out a final, agonized scream, a desperate cry, before the darkness consumed him entirely. His body convulsed, and with one last breath, Simon ceased to exist. The once bright village Simon called home faded into a distant memory. The world welcomed a new entity, born of hunger and guilt, a shadow with no end in sight. It carried Simon's memories, his regrets, and his torment, but none of his humanity. And as it moved through the night, spreading fear and despair, a small part of Simon's soul lingered, silently weeping for what he had lost.